In 1807, a case was tried in the federal court for the Circuit of Virginia, which was of fundamental significance to governmental power and individual rights in America. The case is known as the United States versus Aaron Burr. The charge against Aaron Burr, former Vice President of the United States, was treason. It had been brought on the urging of the President himself, Thomas Jefferson. At stake, however, was more than Burr's guilt or innocence. The trial of Aaron Burr turned on the vital question, to what extent can the judicial process, and to what extent will it, protect an individual who is prosecuted by his own government? Or putting it more plainly, who is supreme, the will of the government or the law? In the first decades of the 19th century, two of the great men who dominated the political scene in America clashed over the question. Chief Justice John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States. The two men had clashed before, personally as well as politically. Of supreme importance for Thomas Jefferson was always the will of the people, as expressed by the voice of their elected government. Even the Constitution and the judiciary must bow to it. Of supreme importance to John Marshall, in turn, was always the law, as enshrined in the principles of the Constitution. Nothing was superior to it. Until changed by amendment, it controlled presidents and legislatures. Both men believed profoundly in the tenets for which they fought. For both, consequently, the trial of Aaron Burr was also a trial of their deepest and most sincere convictions.
Don't let him by. There he is.
In March of 1807, Aaron Burr was brought into Richmond, Virginia, by an armed guard. In 1800, Burr had come within a hair's breadth of becoming President of the United States. From 1801 to 1804, he had served as the nation's third Vice President. Shortly thereafter, he had met Alexander Hamilton in a duel, killing his opponent and destroying his own career. From 1805 on, he had traveled through the West, dreaming up extravagant schemes of conquest and adventure. He now faced a trial for his life. Aaron Burr, President Jefferson had claimed, was guilty of treason, guilty beyond a doubt, and the nation largely believed him. The evidence against Burr consisted of reports to the president by men whom Burr had believed to be his friends and allies, General James Wilkinson, General William Eaton, and Colonel George Morgan. Burr, these men had told the president, intended to attack Mexico, to separate the western territories from the Union, and to establish an independent empire with himself at the head. The evidence against Burr on the whole was damaging. It was not, however, conclusive.
No bail, Mr. Hay. I want Mr. Burr held without bail, in jail. See to it. He's a much too dangerous man to be allowed to walk about free.
May I speak frankly, Mr. President?
Speak frankly, Mr. District Attorney.
You're pressing too hard, Mr. President.
My friend Dr. Franklin used to say that a cat in gloves catches no mice.
Oh, let me remind you, Mr. President, that we have the Chief Justice himself to contend with. Burr will be tried in the federal court for the Circuit of Virginia. Mr. Marshall is the presiding judge.
Mr. Marshall, Mr. Marshall. Well, let's see that we don't give Mr. Marshall room to let traitors go about spreading sedition and setting themselves up as kings whenever the fancy strikes them. That man
Mr.
Marshall...
President, this is a difficult case. And that man Marshall is in a position to make it more difficult still, which he will do. Mark my word, if we give him an opportunity to say that the executive is trying to prejudice the case. You know how he feels about the independence of the judiciary.
It's a bit late for that now, don't you think? The President, in his message to Congress, has pronounced Burr guilty. Guilty, beyond doubt.
Before he stood trial, yes. A blunder, Congressman. Nothing less than a blunder.
I meant to alarm the nation. No more, no less.
Which you succeeded in doing, Mr. President, fortunately. If we hadn't pressed this case, Mr. Hay, pressed it hard, we'd by now be looking at the business end of Mr. Burr's cannons. Now, let's keep pressing.
By all means.
Well, now, Mr. Hay, you said this is a difficult case. Why is the case difficult?
It rests on the testimony of General Wilkinson, General Eaton, and Colonel Morgan. Testimony to the effect that Burr intended to divide the Union, to convict him. We need proof that he actually made the attempt. This time, we don't have it.
Well, then, for heaven's sake, let's move. Mr. President, I urge that you give this your fullest personal attention.
No, Congressman. No, no, no. Let the President step back from this case.
I can't step back from this case, Mr. Hay. You know that. The nation's safety is at stake. I'm responsible, as much as I dislike hearing myself bark like an old watchdog.
Mr. President, I wish for nothing more but that justice may be done. I won't avail myself of questionable testimony, and I don't intend to take advantage of reports that have resounded through the newspapers. I rejoice that men of talent and liberality have been found to come forward to defend the accused, notwithstanding the general opinion that he's guilty. Why? Because I want the American people convinced that there's no disposition on the part of this government or myself to persecute Aaron Burr.
Persecute Aaron Burr. I don't propose to persecute Aaron Burr, Mr. Hay. I propose to punish him for the crime of which, without any question, he is guilty. There are serious doubts, Mr. Hay, here and abroad, whether this nation, so recently formed, can and will defend itself against all enemies, internal as well as external. Now, unless we lay these doubts to rest, we cannot last. I want it understood. I want it understood in England, in Spain, and in America, that the United States are a viable and forceful political structure, and that whoever attacks them will feel the consequences. I cannot step back from this case, Mr. Hay, nor will I stop pressing it. Precisely because it is a difficult case. And precisely because we have Mr. Marshall to contend with. Go now, Mr. Hay, go. And put the law to work for us.
On March 30th, Aaron Burr appeared at a hearing held before Chief Justice John Marshall, presiding judge of the federal court for Virginia. Purpose of this hearing, held in Richmond's Eagle Tavern, was to determine whether or not Aaron Burr should be released on bail while waiting for the grand jury to assemble. With John Marshall sat District Court Judge Cyrus Griffin, prominent Virginia jurist. Richmond Attorney John Wickham spoke in behalf of the accused. District Attorney George Hay argued for the government.
Your Honor, the government accuses Aaron Burr of having planned and set in motion an armed insurrection. His aims, as we shall prove, were to separate the Western territories from the Union, to capture by force the city of New Orleans, to make war on Mexico, and to establish a large independent empire with New Orleans as capital and himself at the head. War on Mexico, the attack on a friendly nation is a misdemeanor, a charge on which he may be released on bail. The overthrow of the federal government in the Western Territories, however, is treason, a charge far too serious to admit of bail. The government therefore asks that the accused be committed to jail at once, without bail, and to be held there until a presentation of his case is made to the grand jury.
Is there evidence to support these charges, Mr. Hay?
Mr. Burr's intentions are fully outlined in a letter written by himself to General Wilkinson, and in reports of General Wilkinson and General Eaton to the President.
Will we be able to see those letters, Mr. Hay?
We're herewith submitting them in evidence.
Are these the originals, Mr. Hay?
No, sir, they're copies.
Are they sworn to?
No, sir.
Your Honor,
Yes, Mr. Wickham.
we keep on hearing about Colonel Burr's intentions. The crime of treason requires that war be actually levied against the United States. If an act of war was indeed committed, the government has yet to show us evidence of it.
I was coming to that, Your Honor. The government will prove to the satisfaction of this court that war was levied against the United States by the accused on Benner-Hassett's Island in the state of Virginia on the Ohio River. Our men assembled there on his orders and under his command in November and December of last year, and suitably equipped for their violent enterprise. Men provided with boats, weapons, masses of ammunition and supplies. On December 9th, by orders of the governor of the state of Ohio, 10 boats were intercepted on the river. Others, some of them unfinished, were seized in the boatyard. Some 200 barrels of supplies were confiscated. A few of the boats escaped. They eluded the watch that was set at Cincinnati and went on down to the mouth of the Cumberland.
Mr. Hay, was Colonel Burr among those arrested on the Ohio?
No, sir.
Then Colonel Burr wasn't actually present at the site of the alleged conspiracy.
That is correct, Your Honor.
As a matter of fact, he was hundreds of miles away.
What of it? Whatever went on that island, Mr. Burr planned it and set it in motion. We shall prove this to the satisfaction of the court.
On what evidence, Mr. Hay?
On the letters which we submitted, Your Honor. Burr's letters to General Wilkinson, and the reports of Generals Wilkinson and Eaton to the President.
But these are copies, Mr. Hay, not sworn to. I doubt that any court in the country would accept them as evidence for so serious a charge.
We shall produce all the witnesses this court may require to establish their veracity.
When?
In due time.
In due time? Mr. Hay, if you wish Colonel Burr to be held on a charge of treason without bail, you must show probable cause now. Here. I don't quite understand why you're not better prepared, Mr. Hay. It's been 4 months since those men were arrested.
Your Honor, Benner-Hassett's Island is hundreds of miles away in the very thick of our western wilderness. We need time.
I'm astounded, Mr. Hay. I'm astounded at the government's conduct of this case. Colonel Burr has been publicly pronounced a traitor, guilty beyond doubt. Yet the evidence to support this charge, if it exists at all, lies buried somewhere in the, what did you call it? The very thick of our western wilderness? I'm of the opinion, Mr. Hay, that our laws do not permit that the hand of malignity may grasp any individual against whom its hate might be directed, or whom it may capriciously seize, charge with some secret crime, and put him on proof of his innocence.
Objection, Your Honor. That's a very unfortunate choice of words.
Your objection is noted, Mr. Hay. As to your request that Colonel Burr be held on a charge of treason without bail, the court denies it. Lack of evidence to support your charge leaves us no choice.
John Marshall declined for lack of evidence to hold Aaron Burr on the charge of treason without bail. He acknowledged, however, that there was probable cause for a charge of high misdemeanor. Burr, after all, in a letter to a man whom he believed to be a close ally, General James Wilkinson, had clearly set forth a plan to attack a friendly neighbor, Mexico. Free on bail, Burr would now await a hearing of his case before the grand jury. It was still possible for that jury to indict him for treason, but the prosecution and President Jefferson knew now that they had a fight on their hands.
Drop the treason charge, Mr. Hay?
Drop the treason charge, yes, Mr. President. Press the lesser one. High misdemeanor. Burr's plans to attack Mexico. We have those in his own writing. We'll get a conviction on misdemeanor. That's virtually certain.
Judgment, Mr. Hay, judgment. What does Anthony say? It's fled to brutish beasts. I am referred to as the hand of malignity in open court, accused of grasping Mr. Burr, the helpless victim of my hate, capriciously. And you propose that I withdraw from the contest.
I must warn you, Mr. President, not to consider this a personal contest between yourself and the Chief Justice.
The President is right, Mr. Hay. You're asking him to proclaim publicly that he was wrong, that he pronounced Burr a traitor, but knowing the accusation to be false, did not dare present it in court. You're asking that he expose himself to being called a liar. That's impossible, Mr. Hay. The prestige of the presidency forbids it.
The prestige of the presidency, in my opinion, is better served by a verdict of guilty, no matter on what charge, than an acquittal.
Not at all, Mr. Hay, not at all. Mr. Marshall himself has seen to that. If Burr is found innocent, it will be said that the President did his duty, but that the Chief Justice protected the traitor in order to teach his President a lesson in propriety. Well, we're fortunate, Mr. Hay. You claimed that my intemperance has endangered our cause. Well, Mr. Marshall's intemperance has made us even. We're even, Mr. Hay.
Not quite, Mr. President. Mr. Marshall has asked us for evidence in support of the government charges. We do not have it.
You'll have all the evidence that's needed, Mr. Hay. I have ordered the Treasury to place all available contingency funds at your disposition. This country will be swept with a fine meshed net. There's a man alive who can testify to this case. He will be at your beck and call. No, we will press the treason charge, Mr. Hay. Then sit back and see how the game develops.
On May 22nd, 1807, the grand jury hearing began in the case against Aaron Burr. Only a fraction of the government witnesses had arrived when on June 9, Burr made a bold and unheard of request.
Your Honor,
Yes, Mr. Burr.
with the permission of the court, I should like to submit a motion.
You may proceed.
In his message to Congress last January, President Jefferson pronounced me guilty. Guilty beyond doubt. He did so on the basis of a letter of mine and certain other papers which he said he received from General Wilkinson. The court has seen only copies of parts of these documents. I now consider it material to my defense that the originals in their entirety be produced in this court. Therefore, Your Honor, I ask this court to issue a subpoena to the President of the United States, ordering him to appear in this court and to produce the documents in question.
You wish us to summon the President in your defense? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, Your Honor. The papers which I am requesting will cast serious doubt on the credibility of my accusers and prove my innocence. Your Honor,
Yes, Mr. Hay.
the prosecution will attempt to procure the papers requested by Mr. Burr, provided the court finds that they're material.
Well, how can the court decide whether or not they're material unless we have an opportunity to examine them?
Is this court seriously considering Mr. Burr's request to summon the President, Your Honor?
I haven't decided, Mr. Hay.
Well, I submit that the request is highly disrespectful to the President and to the Presidents.
Your Honor,
Yes, Mr. Wickham.
We insist that an accused man has the right to obtain all necessary witnesses in his behalf, even if one of the witnesses be the president. Why a denial of this right has not been heard in an American court since the Declaration of Independence. What is at stake is not merely due process of law for Colonel Burr. At stake is the right to due process for every citizen of this country, for all time to come. We strongly urge our request be granted.
Your Honor, we don't deny a man's right to obtain witnesses in his behalf. However, we do question the authority of this court to issue the writ which has been requested.
Why, Mr. Hay? Is there anything in the Constitution that would prevent a federal court from subpoenaing the president?
No, Your Honor, not that I know of.
Your Honor, the president has undertaken to prejudice the country against my client by declaring that, and I quote him, there can be no doubt of his guilt. He has proclaimed him a traitor and has set on him the dogs of war and the hellhounds of persecution. I need not belabor the fact that the president's action is unconstitutional. It's plain as day. The president has no right to pronounce on the guilt or innocence of an American citizen. That, Your Honor, is the business of the court. But the president has done just that. Now, I ask you, can he, who has raised this absurd clamor, presume to hold back evidence which is needed for a trial in which the very life of the accused is at stake? Perish the thought.
May I ask what counsel for the defense expects to achieve with this kind of philippics against the government? Does he hope that the court will accept a political diatribe in lieu of legal argument, and that the court will find Mr. Burr innocent for no other reason than to teach the president propriety? What would a foreigner think if he heard in a federal court the president of the United States referred to as a bloodhound hunting down his man in savage anger? And what would he think if this court should tolerate such language?
Your Honor!
Gentlemen, you will restrain yourselves, please. I have asked for arguments on the court's authority to issue the writ requested by Colonel Burr. That and only that is the point now before this court. Now, Mr. Wickham, in your opinion, has this court the authority to subpoena the president?
Yes, Your Honor. The president is no more than a servant of the people. As such, he is subject to the laws of the land. If the Constitution provides an exemption for him from these laws, I am not aware of it.
Mr. Hay?
I must agree, Your Honor, the president can be subpoenaed as a witness. However, I urge that the writ not be granted unless it is absolutely necessary.
Well, why is that, Mr. Hay?
The documents requested by Mr. Burr of a private nature, they bear on the prestige of the presidency, on the security of the United States, on our relationship to foreign powers. They should not be made public.
What Burr demanded specifically was this. He demanded that President Jefferson produce the original of Burr's letter to General Wilkinson, the original of the general's report to the president's answer, and finally, the president's orders to Army and Navy with respect to Burr's arrest. The question now was, could the president, and should he, be forced to appear in court and to lay open his records for public inspection?
I assure you, I will not lend aid to a motion manifestly designed to show disrespect to the government or to endanger public safety. But how can I refuse to sustain a motion for documents to which the accused is clearly entitled and which may be material to his defense?
I don't believe the nation would profit from seeing its president on the witness stand. Would you have subpoenaed General Washington?
I can think of no legal objections to issuing a subpoena to any person whatever, so long as the case was such as to justify the process. Would you have it said that an American court refused a man the use of evidence that might have saved his life?
By the same token, Mr. Marshall, what if the president refuses to comply with the subpoena? Would you have it said that the courts of this country have not the power to enforce justice as they see it?
What is it?
Subpoena.
I beg your pardon.
I am directed to appear in court in connection with the trial of Aaron Burr, Esquire, and there to produce certain letters and papers now in my possession.
I don't believe it.
That man is bent on showing me that the judiciary is master of the house. I can't take it in. Mind you, it is the judiciary that keeps harping on independence. It keeps shouting in my ear that the leading principle of the Constitution is the independence of the three branches from each other. Now, how in the devil's name do they square that with their demand that I submit to their wishes? Subject to imprisonment. In case of disobedience, subject to imprisonment.
Ignore it. By all means, ignore it.
That, I'm afraid, is impossible, Congressman. The Constitution guarantees any prisoner's speedy and public trial and compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his behalf. It's more than a dead letter. Any person charged with a crime in the courts of the United States has the right, before and after indictment, to ask the court to compel the appearance in court of his witnesses.
On the other hand, Mr. Hay, the Constitution assigns me certain duties that require my ongoing presence in this office. If I accede to this, the courts of this country will be dragging me from pillar to post. I'll be constantly trudging north to south, east to west.
You'll not comply, then?
I will not comply, no.
The court can order your arrest. You know that, I'm sure.
I wouldn't advise that. You tell them that, Mr. Hay. Tell Mr. Marshall.
No. Don't, Mr. President. Let him give it a try. Let's have a test and see this thing once and for all.
It wouldn't enhance anyone's standing in the eyes of the nation. Neither the Chief Justices nor the President's.
You're not suggesting that we submit, are you, Mr. Hay?
No, Congressman, I'm not. I'm not suggesting anything. Frankly, I wouldn't know what to suggest.
Tell the Chief Justice that he can make public any letter that Burr wants after you, Mr. Hay, have excised those sections that are not directly material to the purposes of the trial. As for the other documents that he's asked for, there's so much of it that it would amount to laying open the whole of the executive records, and this I refuse to do. Tell the Chief Justice that the Secretary of War will examine them to see if there are any documents that can be turned over to the courts. And that, Mr. Hay, is as far as I will go. Tell him. Tell him that I expect him to remain within the bounds of prudence and good faith.
Yes, Mr. President.
Oh, and Mr. Hay.
Yes, Mr. President?
Talk to him gently.
Yes, Mr. President.
I don't want him riled any more than is absolutely necessary.
Gentlemen.
Judge Griffin.
Welcome.
This is Chief Justice.
Come in, gentlemen, come in. Well, will you do me the honor?
Certainly.
Mr. Hay? Mr. Wickham?
I carry instructions from the President.
Ah.
He asked me to assure you of a spirit of conciliation, as well as a desire on his part to avoid conflicts of authority between high branches of government. Conflicts which could necessarily discredit all involved at home and abroad.
A spirit of conciliation. Shall we drink to that, gentlemen?
The President will comply with the subpoena, then?
In part.
In part.
The President feels strongly that his appearance in this court would mean that the executive branch, the sole branch of government which the Constitution requires always in function, could be withdrawn from its station by any coordinate authority. The President would not cooperate in this kind of diminution of his office.
I must answer that despite his high office, the President, as any other man, is accountable to the laws of the Constitution. I don't say this lightly, Mr. Hay. I don't find my duty particularly pleasant, but it is clear.
The President suggested that, should that be your answer, you might make plans for his arrest. On the other hand, though he will not appear in person, he is willing to turn over to the court the papers it has asked for, relevant to the charge the President has made.
But Mr. Hay, these aren't the originals, they're copies. How do we know whether or not they're accurate and complete?
The President reserves the privilege of deciding what may be made public.
That decision will be made by the court, Mr. Hay. Where are the originals, Mr. Hay?
They're in the hands of the Attorney General, Mr. Rodney. I understand the President has instructed Mr. Rodney to turn them over to me.
To you?
Yes, sir. The President directed me to use my own judgment in withholding such information as is not directly material for the purposes of justice.
What do you make of this, Mr. Griffin?
Being a mere twig on the high branches of government, I should think it a very satisfactory compromise between the President and the Chief Justice of the United States.
Can any compromise be considered satisfactory, Mr. Griffin?
If it is a compromise between two gentlemen of equal stature, I should say yes. Consider, Mr. Marshall, you subpoenaed the President. He acknowledged your right to do so. In fact, he has substantially complied with it.
But not fully.
Not fully, no. He claimed executive privilege, but remember, General Washington did so before him. As for his personal appearance in court,
the President has asked me to convey his hope that the Chief Justice will allow the question to lie for the present. Before long, legislative means will be supplied for giving individuals the benefit of the testimony of executive functionaries without breaking up the government.
fair enough.
You realize, of course, that we'll never see the originals.
Quite possible.
May I tell the President the Chief Justice doubts the wisdom of an attempt to enforce his subpoena?
The President will, I presume, resist such an attempt?
I believe he would.
John Marshall's subpoena to President Jefferson was never fully complied with, nor actually enforced. The encounter between the two men and between their respective branches of government ended in a stalemate. Yet, a subpoena had been issued to an American president, and the legitimacy of the process, the president's answerability to the courts of justice, had in principle been established. Thus, the power of the courts to compel the production of evidence, in some circumstances, even from the president himself, was foreshadowed. The confrontation between John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson over Aaron Burr was not over, however. It had, in fact, only just begun.